Now, when it comes to the entertainment industry these days, it often feels like originality is all but dead, that nearly everything that comes out is something that's been done before in some way, shape, or form, that everything is a remake or a sequel or comes from a popular book or a comic, or is just the continuation or resurrection of a well-known and long-standing franchise. And of course, one of the big reasons for this, the main reason if we're being honest, is that nostalgia sells. Something that is already popular and beloved, that has history, comes with a built-in audience that are almost guaranteed to consume the new content because of their connection to the old. And when done right, people can and will enjoy seeing something from their past brought back and carried on. It can be very emotional, in some cases even profound, to see the final chapter of a story or character that you've cared about for most of your life to take place on the big or even small screen. And usually no one will mind, the fans won't mind, that behind the scenes, yes, huge profits for the studio or company that owns it can and will follow. But the key words there are when done right, because there is a double-edged sword at play here. Because along with all the sentimental attachment people have for old properties they love, comes, to some degree, what you could call a sense of belonging or even ownership that they can be very protective of, that can cause them to get, shall we say, angry when they feel what they love isn't being respected, or worse yet, is just being exploited for profit. Oftentimes these days we even talk about toxic fandoms, where unhappy fans maybe go too far with their criticisms or attack anything from the actors, directors, to fellow fans over what they see as a failing of their favorite franchises. There's even a saying that no one hates Star Wars like Star Wars fans. That tends to go along with that franchise, of course. And though by no means do I condone poor behavior or want to defend it, some fans arguably do of course go too far. But toxic fandoms can really only exist when something has become that popular and beloved. When people care so much about something, when they again feel very possessive of it, that they go out of their way to, from their point of view, defend it or criticize the way it's being handled now. And I obviously don't mean they feel a literal sense of ownership, but rather an emotional one, that the stories and characters can be so fondly remembered and important to them, so ingrained in their minds as something akin to heroes or even friends from their childhood, that the last thing they want to see are those characters or stories used for the sake of making movies that don't honor, or sometimes all but disregard, what came before, what these characters are or mean to them. And what tends to burn them even more inside is that they know it's usually done simply to fill the coffers of a studio or company that doesn't actually care about, well, any of it, one that doesn't have any sort of genuine desire or plan on carrying on the franchise in a meaningful way, but still want to reap the rewards anyway, that still want to exploit the customer base that's in place. One that hires people with no sort of actual passion for the franchise, or any sort of love, or sometimes even knowledge or understanding of the franchise, to make the films or series or whatever it might be. Take the film Matrix Resurrections, for example, and be warned, some minor spoilers for it are ahead. Anyway, in the new film we learn that Neo, or Mr. Anderson, is back in the Matrix and that he's forgotten the events of the original 3 films. Well, sort of anyway. Turns out he apparently turned them into a series of extremely popular video games that took the world by storm some 20 years ago, just like the films in real life. But he thinks he's created them, not that they actually happened or that are taken from his own experiences. And now the company he works for has been tasked by Warner Brothers, ironically enough, to make a 4th Matrix game, and that they're going to make it with or without the help of the original creator, because, well, they know it'll be a hit one way or the other. They basically just want to make money from this property that they own. And what follows this then is a very meta montage, you could call it, where we see the employees of this company brainstorming over the course of a couple days, trying to figure out what it was that made the first Matrix games great, why they were so popular, and what they can do with the sequel to capture that same magic. They even talk about how reboots sell, and Neo even sort of belittles his own games by saying they were something that kept some children entertained. And while watching this, and especially after the film is over and you get this feeling, whether you enjoyed the film or not, that it was a story that really didn't need to be told, that it didn't really offer anything all that new for the old characters or introduce any new ones that you really got to know or cared about. In fact, I don't remember the name of any of the new characters. But anyway, you get this feeling like something like that brainstorming session actually took place for the film itself, that this is a very meta moment within the movie, that it's not just them brainstorming for the game, it was them brainstorming for the film itself. You get this sense, true or not, that the studio, Warner Brothers, was going to make a fourth Matrix film one way or another, and that they ended up trying to back-engineer the film rather than make one from someone's genuine inspiration for an actual Matrix sequel. And the problem with that approach is that, no surprise, genuine inspiration, someone with a big idea that wants to see their creation brought to life for the sake of it, actual passion and desire, tends to lead to a far superior story, and one enjoyed more by the fans, more so than a bunch of people sitting around a room trying to figure out and then mimic or back-engineer the success of something that already exists. And I can certainly see something like this brainstorming session taking place for the Star Wars sequel trilogy. I can imagine as the ink was drying on the contract after George Lucas sold Lucasfilm, and the first thing Disney announced was that they were going to make a sequel trilogy. But anyway, I can imagine some of the top dogs at Disney trying to figure out what to do with the sequel trilogy. How can they create something that is extremely successful and profitable? How can they back-engineer the success of the original trilogy while avoiding the mistakes of the prequels from their point of view? And just like in the montage during the Matrix Resurrections, at Disney, at no point was it asked what is best for the story of Star Wars. Never was that mentioned, much less discussed and seriously considered. It was all about what will sell to the masses. How can we duplicate what was already done? And what they came up with for the sequel trilogy was shiny yet empty new characters like Captain Phasma, and adding in a new main character droid, that being BB-8, not because a new sort of lead droid makes sense for the story, but because he'd sell some toys, or so they hoped. All the while then R2 and 3PO got more or less sidelined, even though in the prequels Lucas didn't introduce any new main character droids. He stuck with the original two and made them important parts of the story, even shoehorning some strange origins in there for them, you could argue, especially with 3PO, because one of his ideas for Star Wars was that the story would be seen or told through the eyes of these two droids, something the sequel trilogy either didn't know or just didn't care about carrying forward. But that wasn't the only thing that didn't get carried forward in the sequels. The main three characters from the original trilogy, Han, Luke, and Leia, all got regressed back to where they were when the previous trilogy, or the original trilogy, started. They try to sell the same sort of story all over again, try to capture that same magic, I guess. Han is a smuggler again, Leia is once again leading a rebellion, and Luke is again stuck on a remote world with no idea what the Jedi actually are. Not to mention, halfway through Episode 7, the Republic they worked and fought so hard to rebuild or to liberate from the clutches of the Empire is just blasted. Everything from the previous part of the story from the original trilogy is essentially erased, just for the sake of being able to do it all over again, and arguably not as well. But I guess at least all the original trilogy characters got integrated into the new story in some respect. At least they have some sort of part to play. At least we see them again, though we do never see them all together again. Because other than a few small references here and there, the sequels seem to pretend that the prequel trilogy doesn't actually exist. Heck, the name Anakin is never even uttered in any of the sequel films, much less the character himself make an appearance in the form of a Force ghost to, interact with his son Luke Skywalker. Well, unless you count the few lines he uttered at the end of The Rise of Skywalker, along with all the other Jedi. And sure, I guess we could make the argument that in the grand scheme of things, when it comes to the more casual fan or the average viewer, that the prequels are not as beloved as the original trilogy, and I'm not trying to anger prequel fans or anything by saying that. I personally love and enjoy the prequels. They are more than a worthy addition to the Star Wars canon, in my opinion. But there is or was a belief out there, right or wrong, that a lot of people don't like the prequels, and that's why they were a bit sidelined in the sequels, you could say. Either way, intentionally ignoring them or not, we can contrast what the Star Wars sequel trilogy did with the prequel trilogy with what something like Cobra Kai has done with its, again, arguably less than beloved sequels to the original Karate Kid, and I'm talking about Karate Kid 2 and 3, because Cobra Kai not only acknowledges those films exist and are a part of the canon, it absolutely and entirely embraces them to not only make the show itself better, but to make those other films better as well. I mean, as much as I loved the first Karate Kid film, and I liked the second one as well, I've never really had much desire to go back and watch the third one ever again, not until the character of Terry Silver was brought back in Season 4 of Cobra Kai, and now I have gone back and watched Karate Kid 3 again, and though it's still not the best film ever made, I actually enjoyed it and appreciated it a heck of a lot more than I ever would have or could have without Cobra Kai. Not that I probably would have ever watched it again if it wasn't for Cobra Kai. And that brings us to another thing that's great about this series about Cobra Kai, which is the way it treats the sequels to The Karate Kid. At times, I don't want to say it makes fun of those other films of Karate Kid 2 and 3, but it certainly acknowledges that they were, shall we say, a bit silly or ridiculous, that they weren't the best stories or films ever made, and that at times even the series itself is a bit silly when you stop and think about it, that it's all about a war between karate dojos in the valley, but it does it all in a way that doesn't disrespect any of it. Again, it embraces its flaws, you could say, and treats them with reverence nonetheless to make the whole package, the series and the films, overall better. Also, the way it treats its old or original main characters, mainly Johnny, Daniel, and Kreese, is near perfection, and they manage to blend their stories in, again, with all this other existing canon and other characters from the previous films, and to make the stories of the brand new characters equally interesting and compelling. All around, this show is one of the most uncanny things and uncanny successes I have ever seen, and anyone wanting to reboot an old franchise should watch it for research purposes. Because it somehow manages to both respect the old stories and characters to bring them back and put them in a place that, sure, might be a bit unexpected, but still makes sense to where they were when we last saw them, and to continually then challenge them in interesting ways, while again, never having them overshadow the new characters. Which, of course, was one of the reasons why J.J. Abrams said he put Luke Skywalker on that island and had him only appear at the very end of The Force Awakens, not even saying a single word. And that's because he was afraid Luke would overshadow all the new characters. He didn't know how to incorporate him into the story while also getting people to care about Rey, Poe, Finn, and so on, which doesn't show a lot of faith in your ability to write good new characters. We also then know, of course, what happened next. We know what happened because JJ was afraid to do anything with Luke, and that is that Rian Johnson took the mystery of why Luke was on that island and came up with a story that split the fan base in two. One where things had not gone so well for Luke in the meantime or since we last saw him in the original trilogy. And it was a story that some fans ended up loving, of course, and some ended up very much hating. We quite literally saw how nostalgia can be a double-edged sword with that one. And sadly, we'll always be left to wonder what could have been with the sequels. What if Luke had been more in line with what I think most fans had expected him to be like in the sequels? And if he had been a big part of The Force Awakens? And what if the sequels had embraced the prequel trilogy? What if the father-son story with Luke and Anakin had been actually explored, to at least some degree? And kind of speaking of carrying on the story of a character from the past, or from previous films as faithfully as possible, we now come to Spider-Man No Way Home, and spoilers ahead if you haven't seen it, but never before has a film embraced the idea of bringing in as many previous characters as possible, from past movies or wherever, and trying to give them all a truly meaningful story, even its villains, as this film did. It handled nostalgia on a, shall we say, Cobra Kai level by bringing back extremely popular characters and carrying on their story in a meaningful way, giving emotional resolutions not just to heroes from previous Spider-Man iterations, but some of the villains as well. And it did that by embracing both the good and maybe less than good of those previous stories, all the while creating an impactful story for the brand new characters, or should I say newer, since, in all fairness, they are not even close to being brand new characters at this point. And the end result then of No Way Home is something that is not only already one of, if not the most beloved and popular superhero films of all time, but something that has already made a ton of money at the box office, and will end up being one of the most profitable films in history, all because they got nostalgia and fan service right. Okay here, so all that said, what's the takeaway? Well, it's that, again, nostalgia is or can be a double-edged sword. That fans don't want to see favorite characters brought back or stories revived unless there is something worthy to tell or explore. They can't simply sit down, brainstorm, and back engineer something to be as good, memorable, and ultimately as profitable as the original. Because that's not what led to these great characters and stories in the first place. It was genuine inspiration and the desire to create something truly memorable that did. And if you want to have any hope of recapturing that, the same sort of mindset has to be in place. You have to want to honor what came before, to respect it, even the parts of it that maybe weren't as good as others. But the real key here is that once who and what a character is and is all about gets embedded in our minds, it's not easy to accept them either being reimagined or put in a place we never could have seen them ending up in, not without a heck of an explanation. The reason why so many dislike Luke in The Last Jedi, that he gave up, isn't because they could never see Luke ever failing and giving up. It's because it doesn't seem to be the path he's on when we last see him, and if you want to redirect him, you have to earn it, you have to show it. Whereas the reason why people love that Johnny Lawrence from Karate Kid became a failure or a lovable loser trying to get his life on track in Cobra Kai is because we can see that being what happens to him after the Karate Kid. We can see that being the path he'd go down, while we can also see Daniel going on to bigger and better things, being a huge success, but also struggling to keep himself grounded, to keep himself true to the teachings of his late Master Miyagi. And if they'd done something like that for Luke, I certainly think that is a story most people would have really gotten into. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think about nostalgia and the entertainment industry's use, or maybe overuse, of it. And what are the ways to use it right? And what are the ways to use it wrong? Is it a double-edged sword? Whatever you think, leave a comment below, and let's talk some Star Wars, and maybe some Cobra Kai and other things as well. And until next time, thanks for watching.